Um, yeah, so we were supposed to talk about attention with Jochen Trisch today, but Jochen had an emergency, so he will only come tomorrow. And then I thought, okay, let's, in some way we still deal with the topic, but I also want to go a little bit back to what we discussed at the beginning of the course, which is really this system level perspective. If you want to understand the brain, it's a bit a question like, so in Aldo's case, what Aldo takes this physiological approach, and of course you have to also reduce a lot of complexity to actually make a measurement you can understand and interpret. But on the other hand, you know, you look at this brain as an integrated system. So even though these observations should give us important guidance in explaining what the functions of the system, we have to also find ways and methods to, again, take that system view. And I think that's really where the machine comes in. And what I want to talk about is really, on the one hand, what's consciousness, how can we explain consciousness, and why is building machine consciousness scientifically an important step in making progress in this direction. Now, so here you see humanity's three big questions, right? So look, at your age, you guys all should have this unbounded ambition to get a one-way ticket to Mars with Tim here. So look, humanity is facing actually only three big challenges, and the rest is all derived from that. All right, the one is the origin of the universe, what's the origin of life, and what's the origin of consciousness. And these are really our big challenges. And now what you can say is that, okay, in some sense we made quite some progress with at least gaining an understanding of the universe, to the extent that we can send people on one-way trips to Mars. In the mid-20th century we made quite some big strides in our understanding of life with, let's say, the description of the structure of DNA and all its derived implications. But with respect to consciousness, it looks like we're just barely scratching the surface. All right, so this also for, in my own case, I try to stay away from consciousness for a long time as a scientific topic, because it seems to touch upon so many aspects of mind and brain that you can easily drown in if you're not well prepared. But you know, at some point, if you get older, you lose your inhibitions more and more, and then at some point you feel ready, you can attack these kinds of complex problems. So I do believe that now we are in a position to start to at least make progress on this whole issue of consciousness. And I would like to explain that to you. So my introduction to the consciousness field was a review I wrote in 1992, so it's a few years ago. This was a review of Gerald Edelman's book, The Remembered Present, and this was Jerry Edelman's theory on consciousness. And Jerry Edelman, Nobel laureate, he won the Nobel Prize for his work in the early 60s on the structure of immunoglobulin. So he really determined that our immune system works as a selectionist system, right? So that means you have hypervariability of these antibodies you generate, and then those that match whatever you encounter in the world get amplified. So you have differential amplification. So it's a very Darwinian system, if you want. And Jerry, having unbridled ambition, then decided to apply this way of thinking to the brain. So that was he hoped that to be his second Nobel Prize. And then he, at the same time that Francis Crick started to make noise, you know, Francis Crick, the co-discoverer of the structure of DNA with Watson. So at the same time that Crick was starting to write and talk about consciousness, Jerry Edelman was doing the same thing. So he wrote a book, The Remembered Present, and what he tried to say in the title is basically our present, our experience of the present is predicated on our memory of the past. So in that book, so I quote here a bit from my review, and I indicate here with these bars, positive and negative, but the big problem I faced trying to figure this theory out, and I will say a few more words about it later, is that you keep on coming back to this fundamental doubt, like, can we actually say anything sensible about a phenomenon like consciousness? It sounds all very confusing, it's subjective. Subjectivity seems to be beyond the scientific method, because in science we try to describe things objectively. And how can I objectively describe a state that is intrinsically subjective? And that's also what David Chalmers, a philosopher, has called the heart problem. And Nagel, in his famous essay, "What's it like to be a bat?" goes to the same point, right? He says, well, can we scientifically describe, or can we ever externally understand what it is like to be a bat? And the conclusion of the whole essay is, no, we cannot unless you are that bat. And bats have still problems with typewriters and keyboards, so it will never be written up. So this is really the fundamental challenge. This is really how I measure also what I'm trying to achieve myself here, is can we really say something sensible about consciousness? Okay. So let's see how much sensible things we can say about it. So here we have one of the things we have been doing. This is very much work of Stefan and Vicky and others and Alex in the experimental functional Android assistant project. And here we are working on our robot DJ. So this is one of the paradigms we're developing here. So it's basically that we have a robot that can DJ together with people. Of course, this is a rather unstructured environment, because you have all these kids and they do wild things, and you explain, no, you cannot put the objects there, and of course they put them there. And so what this clip illustrates, why I bring it up, is not only that I force lots of people I work with to do things in public events and so on, but I believe that there's something very special about this kind of social interaction that really speaks to this challenge of consciousness. And the other thing that this already shows is that I do believe that for us to make progress in understanding consciousness, we really have to resort to building conscious machines. And so let's see what the arguments are behind this. So I really feel that our fundamental challenge in neuroscience is to reconnect flesh to psyche. Right? So the point is, and that's also what Francis Crick called his astonishing hypothesis. And in some sense it's not so astonishing, in other senses it is. So Francis Crick says in this book, the Astonishing Hypothesis, that, you know, it is actually astonishing to realize that everything we experience, everything we think, everything we do, everything we are, is really coming out and controlled by this piece of flesh in our skull, the brain. And subjectively, it's very difficult to relate to that, right? So, but in neuroscience, we often forget that in the end, what we're trying to explain are these functional capabilities of brains, as we also saw in our previous talk, right, where you look at problem solving. So it's not only we try to understand, let's say, molecular structures in the brain or the structure of neurons and so on. In the end, what we try to explain are all these functions that traditionally were in the realm of psychology. So as far as I'm concerned, our real challenge is to build a new psychology that is grounded in biology. And I feel that consciousness is a strongly integrative concept that can help us to do that. So here I have my conscious chip that we built last year. No, this is not true. This is a projection of a neuroprosthetic system of which we built several prototypes of the cerebellum. Okay, and you can talk about the details of this with different people here in the room, like Ivan, for instance. And this device, not in this exact form, but the neuroprosthetic system of the cerebellum we built, doesn't really matter too much that you understand how it works, but essentially on chip we had signal processing stages, we had an emulation of the core structure, the core circuits of the cerebellum. We interfaced that to the input structures of the cerebellum, performed the processing on the chip, and sent the output back into the brain of the rat. And with this device, we could replace the circuits that do eye blink conditioning. All right. So, but the amazing thing is that if you look at the brain, and you look at the different structures, so here we have the cerebellum, here is the cerebral cortex, okay, here we have the hippocampus, nucleus accumbens on the top here, and all around the structures like the thalamus. If you look at the numbers of the brain, so in total our brain has about 90 billion neurons, okay? And these numbers only have become available very recently. Like they were sort of, no one had really counted them. But now finally we have methods to do that. But now if you look at the relative size and structure and density of different parts of the brain, you see that actually the majority of these neurons, so 69 billion of the 86 billion, form what's called the cerebellum. Okay? Which is, I mean, they're very dense because the majority are the so-called granule cells. They're really very small. For many years, people could not even measure for them. They were that small. So we see, even though we measure a lot from this outer structure called the cerebral cortex, which is about the size of 2 pizzas stuffed into your skull, and this is what happens when you stuff a pizza in the shape of a skull. So even though we measure and we know a lot about the cerebral cortex, in terms just of the numbers of cells, it's not the largest structure in the brain. So what is interesting here is that lesions to the structure of the cerebellum, which is the majority of the cell population of your brain, lesions to the structure actually will not affect conscious states. Okay, so you will have motor deficits, right? But these patients will not experience any changes in how they deal with the world. It's not that suddenly they're unconscious, or they have, let's say, they cannot experience parts of the world to engage with and so on. And this seems very surprising, right? So why would such a huge chunk of neural hardware be operating fully under the radar of what we call consciousness? And this is especially surprising, of course, if you adhere to a more Cartesian view on consciousness, where you would see really conscious states as being the determinants of our behavior, right? That we cause, also consciously we cause our behavior. So if you then see that suddenly huge chunks of neural hardware are outside of that window, that seems surprising. So this is the first question that I would like to deal with.
Well, is that too much of a strong claim? I mean, if you woke up tomorrow without a cerebellum, you would feel like a different person, surely.
Yeah, but your consciousness as such is not affected, right? You're still conscious. You experience. Of course, you will experience that you cannot move your body anymore correctly, for instance. But experience as such, the content of experience, its capacities, and all of this is still there. Right? I'm not saying the content of consciousness doesn't change. For sure it will, because you are changed. The way you control your body has changed. This will feed into how you experience the world. But the ability to experience and the richness of that experience as such is intrinsically not changed. Okay, like for instance, if you take an extreme example, if you take propofol as an anesthetic, right, you will slowly become unconscious. And we know this happens because propofol interacts or modulates the thalamocortical system in its activity. Right, so there you see, okay, interfering with the thalamocortical system changes states of consciousness. But the cerebellum as such doesn't have that impact. Are you satisfied with that?
Well, consciousness could be a graded thing, and so you're talking of it more or less as falling into one or other category. You're conscious or you're not conscious.
Well, indeed. So in people, you have levels of consciousness, like you go from sleep to wakefulness, and there are some stages in between. Or you might have coma, vegetative state. Then you have now minimally conscious states, and so on. These are levels of consciousness, but I'm saying these levels of consciousness are not affected by lesions to the cerebellum. And then you have the content of consciousness. And the content of consciousness is defined by who you are, what you do, and so on. Right? So the content of consciousness might be affected. Levels of consciousness are not. There's no literature, there's no clinical literature whatsoever that would suggest that lesions to the cerebellum in humans affect levels of consciousness.
Does it depend a little bit what you're calling consciousness? I mean, you're thinking more like first-person perspective?
No, look, we can do this very pragmatically, right? Because you would basically assess this clinically, like you look at the responsiveness of the patient, for instance. So on all these clinical measurements that are being used for consciousness, there's no impact of lesions to the cerebellum. Okay? Yes, please.
If we look at it from a psychoanalytic point of view, we have different kind of consciousness. We have the subconscious, the conscious, the superego. We have all this kind of consciousness. Is there, and for the moment, I would say that we assume that what the psychoanalytics say is as true as it can get. as it can get.
Did you talk about that with your mother?
No.
Maybe you should. No, look, the point is...
Psychoanalyst in the family. My question is there any study or any evidence that some people that have some relation, because unfortunately this is a study that you can only do on humans, some people with some lesioned part of the brain miss some level of consciousness?
Yes, certainly. So for the thalamic lesions, or take, you have different forms of this, right? So you can, for instance, people who have lesions to the reticular formation in the brainstem, that would directly affect levels of consciousness, because in the reticular formation you have these activating systems, you use different neuromodulators like acetylcholine, that diffusely project in many brain areas, and this one they set the working level of these systems. So lesions in those structures, often fatal, but will directly affect levels of consciousness, right? On the other hand, you can have a stroke patient who has lesions in their visual hierarchy of the brain, and suddenly they will not be able to experience things anymore in a certain part of the visual field. But then astonishingly, for some of these patients, if you throw an object at them, they can catch it. Okay? And then you say, hey, but you just caught this object, or you pointed to an object in the room, and they will vigorously deny that they can see. So it's called blind sight, right? So you have different variations of this. But again, it's very much levels of consciousness versus content of consciousness. And you are right, Freud's idea of what he also introduced, actually he popularized an idea that was around for quite a while already in the 19th century, that our behavior was very much under the control of factors that we were not consciously experiencing. And indeed, you also see in the current literature that there's a lot of confirmation for that. But it does not separate out so cleanly in these different stages of processing that Freud would have, or in these kind of suppression mechanisms that we're all sexual maniacs and so on, right? I mean, in that sense, it has become a bit more subtle.
But Paul, I think what you're trying to do is say something is consciousness and other things aren't consciousness. But the problem with that approach, I think, is that you end up saying, well, consciousness is some particular set of functions, and typically people focus on things like attention, which I think Francis Crick, for instance.
I'm getting there.
Yeah, but if you try and then go back to Nagel and what it's like to be a bat, what it's like to be a bat isn't about what the bat's attending to, it's about the whole experience of being a bat, and part of that is what the cerebellum of the bat is doing. And I think once you start stripping away all these other things which you say aren't part of consciousness, you lose what it's like to be a person.
Well, but this is levels of consciousness as a processing system and the content of consciousness, right? And I have no problems with that. And as you will see later, I'm actually making quite a point about the different perspectives of consciousness and the need to integrate those. That there is not one.
Throwing away the hard problem.
Sorry?
You're throwing away the hard problem.
The hard problem, I think you want to postpone the hard problem in its core. And I'm only making this point here because in some sense, for my argument, it doesn't matter whether cerebellar lesions affect consciousness for 0% or 5%. Okay? It's not a point really. It's still an astonishing feature that, for instance, stroke patients with lesions to the visual cortex will have neglect, for instance, very directly. While you can have equal-sized lesions to your cerebellum or even larger, and really there are no direct noticeable changes to conscious experience, like you don't act in a part of the world anymore or so. Okay? It's that contradiction, and whether the border is very sharp or fuzzy is actually not really important for the argument. Okay? It seems to be, it shows you that it's a bit another way to look at the Freudian argument, right? Freud says, look, behavior is controlled by unconscious factors. And here, with this example, you're saying, hey, your brain is actually also strongly committed to the unconscious processing of states of the world and action that actually are below the radar of consciousness. This is the key point, why that would be, it's that contradiction. Okay? So this is an adaptation of a proposal by Björn Merker that tries to sketch this notion of a unified scene, right? So since William James, William James, and in some sense, he's really the founding father of modern psychology. and he was writing about all these psychological processes, just sitting in his armchair, essentially, with very little data. Okay, but still his intuitions about many processes are still very influential. And so William James made this very important point about consciousness, that it is sort of this progressive, this advancing coherent scene, right? It is a coherent, integrated experience. Like I'm standing in this room, I see this room, I see you all attentively listening and being highly engaged with whatever I'm saying. It's a unified scene, it's integrated. They're not a bunch of fragments that are floating around. You can experience that under certain conditions. So Björn tried to be a little bit more explicit about this by saying, well, and this unified scene has different modalities, different components. It can be the body, the world, that's what you really experience. And it all comes together in an ego center that sits somewhere behind the bridge of your nose, right? We experience the world as if it all converges somewhere just behind our nose here, which is surprising because you have no direct sensor there. So a core feature, a key feature of conscious states is this notion of a unified scene. And now here we have another robot demo that illustrates a little bit the difficulties of the unified scene, and that also alludes to the point that Björn Merker makes. So here we use a brain-based approach to face recognition for this robot. We have no sound, it seems. Oh, maybe I turned off the sound on the video. Okay. Oh, there you go.
You are networks. I know you. You are Slash. I know you. You are networks. I know you. You are Slash.
So the point is that if you ever look at the world of this robot, if you really look at the camera images, then you see that the actual raw data that goes in, and the same holds for, in our case, certainly when we move about, is actually very noisy, it is jittery, there's lots of movement in these images. And Björn is making the point that the function of consciousness in his proposal is that the brain creates this unified scene to act against these kinds of distortions and noise that we find in our input signals, right? So when I move about, my sensors will be sort of moving. Of course, I have all sort of saccadic systems to stabilize it and so on, but it might not be sufficient. So in Björn's proposal, the unified scene is created to sort of counteract the noise in our sensors. But I think that's not really enough, okay? Now the other thing that is rather impressive about this unified scene is if you use different kinds of drugs like ketamine, it's exactly this notion of unified scene that disappears. So even though we experience under normal conditions the world as unified and coherent and stable, if you are psychotic or you induce psychosis with drugs like ketamine, this is exactly what you experience, the fragmentation of a unified scene. Okay? And so this would suggest, so since it's so drug dependent, and I was a subject in these kinds of experiments on psychosis, and I can tell you it works rather strongly, you really see how the basic structure of reality, space and time for instance, disappear. Right? So in my case, I believe that the room I was looking at was basically residing inside my eyeball, so the whole dimensionality of the world had changed, and events that had happened in the past and I was expecting to be in the future, and vice versa. Events that still had to occur in the future, I believe already had happened in the past. So what I found really interesting about this experience is that not only you get a fragmentation of reality, but you also you lose, if you want, the basic dimensionality, or some Kantian priors, if you want, with which we might structure our knowledge, like space and time. So this would suggest that the unified scene that is constructed for unknown functional reasons is really constructed by a brain actively, and it can be distorted and removed through different kinds of drugs, like ketamine. So if we look at, if we don't think about, okay, but what would be the brain mechanisms behind the construction of such a coherent scene, then we can look here at different levels of consciousness, like for instance, sleep, anesthesia, or vegetative states. So in a vegetative state patient, essentially, these are very low lesions in the brain, often affecting also brainstem areas. So many of the higher areas in the brain are essentially not functioning. Under anesthesia, very often what you approach are key communication structures in the brain, like the thalamus and the cortex, or in slow wave sleep, also strongly regulated by the thalamus. And what this illustrates is that, if you look at these different examples from literature about what are the brain states associated with these different levels of consciousness, you see that they are rather variable and rather broad. Right? So this seems to suggest that the brain states that relate to levels of consciousness are not necessarily very strongly localized. So this suggests, and I will expand that later, that the notion of the integrated scene, of the conscious scene, is the product of a broad state of activity in the brain and not necessarily localized to single regions. So now if we go to the literature, we can look at what are the core ingredients that the specialists believe defines consciousness. What are the core ingredients of conscious states, or its key dimensionality? And I can already tell you that for me, it's an important point to, in the end, find an integration across these key components, as opposed to trying to force a decision that one is the only and unique explanation. So, a number of theorists, so it's Nagel, Thomas Metzinger, but also Bud Craig or Damasio, all emphasize the notion of the physically instantiated self. Right? So, Thomas Metzinger sees consciousness as being strongly structured. So he uses this metaphor for an ego tunnel. It's like a tunnel in which different levels of self are structured through which experience would pass. But the first feature that stands out in the literature is that of the physically instantiated self. So in Damasio's case, he recently proposed, he changed his mind on a number of things, and now his most recent insight is that consciousness, for instance, emerges when cognitive representations of self enter the working memory systems of the frontal cortex, so that now you can have explicit representations of self, and that then sort of ignites consciousness. Okay. I'm not saying this is necessarily true, but the key feature here is that all these main authors, or lead authors that are of influence in the field, are all strongly emphasizing this notion of self. Then if you look at Kevin O'Regan, who also has been a speaker in the summer school 2 occasions, Kevin emphasizes very much this notion of how experience, the qualia, as they're called, are defined in the sensory motor coupling to the world. Right? So Kevin would say, look, first I'm holding this pointer now, okay? My interaction with this pointer follows some law-like regularities that reflect both properties of myself and properties of the world. And it's these law-like regularities that define my qualia, that define the content of consciousness. Okay, so in that sense, in Kevin's case, and he also wrote a book about it recently, what was it now? Why white doesn't sound like a bell or something like this. So it's very much externalized. It's in my direct interaction with the world. It doesn't depend on memorized states and so on. Now, if you go to Gary Haslow or Björn Merker or Grush and Barsalou, they would actually go one step further than Kevin and say, well, actually, a core feature, remember, Björn was saying, look, the conscious scene is there to stabilize your picture of the world. And you do that by predicting. Right? So I move through the world, I make predictions where I'm going, what the world should look like, and that way I can stabilize my conscious scene. Gary Haslow has been advancing this concept also in relation to his work on the cerebellum. So there you would say, well, the content of consciousness and changes to conscious states has a lot to do with how well I can predict events. So if you think about the experience of agency, which is a typical example, agency is, okay, I am the cause of my actions, is then also interpreted in terms of, okay, I can predict the outcomes of my own actions. Now, Jerry Edelman, and that was later picked up by Giulio Tononi, emphasized core qualities of the conscious scene along differentiation and integration. And this basically means that any conscious scene is starkly different from any other conscious scene. So conscious scenes are highly differentiated, and they can occur in many possible forms. But in the meantime, as a single conscious scene, if you can even speak of that, they're highly integrated. They are coherent. Even though the world might be ambiguous, what have you, what I experience leaves no doubt about what I think about that world, how I experience that world. Okay? And then there's a link here to what's also called the global workspace theory that started with Bernie Bars, and that's now advanced further by Stanislav Dehaene and Jean-Pierre Changeux, where basically they have a more, if you want, neural interpretation of this integration that occurs to create a conscious scene. And this essentially means they say, look, the brain is organized around a global workspace. The global workspace is expressed in activity across many different, especially cortical areas. Okay, and if an event, let's say there's a new object appearing in the world, it catches my attention. So now it will exceed in its salience, in its importance, a certain threshold that it will also be injected in this workspace. And whatever resides in this workspace is now my conscious scene. But the conscious scene is not localized. The workspace is not localized. It can actually take information from perceptual modalities, from sensation, but also from memory or from emotional systems. Dependent on the task, dependent on what the organism is doing, different streams will be allowed to enter their information into this global workspace. So if you want, this is a bit more the functional interpretation, and this is its more structural correlate.
Paul,
Yes.
I have to fill a gap here because you're not able to interrupt yourself, obviously. So,
Yes.
and I think you've already made one giant leap, which is to go from consciousness to the idea of a unified scene as being the definition of consciousness. Whereas most people would say first-person perspective is the main criteria for consciousness, surely. And
surely not.
well, let's take an example of ketamine.
Mm-hmm.
When you take ketamine, you still have a first-person experience because you're able to describe it to us later. For me, that's evidence that you're not losing consciousness, or you have an altered state of consciousness, but core consciousness, your first-person perspective on what's happening to you, is preserved. And if that is the case, then almost everything that you say follows from that in terms of what creates the unified scene are not prerequisites for some kind of consciousness that has a first-person perspective.
I don't understand the problem, because actually I'm going to come to the same conclusion you're drawing now, because I'm going to use a very concrete example to say, well, all these suggestions are nice, but I think they're at best necessary conditions of consciousness, but not sufficient.
Okay, I'm surprised not to see first-person perspective given more
Well, but remember, well, this for me was implicitly captured in condition axiom 1, which is self.
Right.
Self and first person perspective are for me rather closely coupled. I didn't say it explicitly, but self to me was more inclusive. Because, for instance, you have out-of-body experiences. These things can happen, right? Then the notion of a first-person perspective becomes a little bit more ambiguous, because where is this self? It's not located in the body anymore, for instance. It's one of the things I also experienced on ketamine. So that's why first-person perspective, I feel, is a bit more restrictive, as opposed to just saying self with its different ramifications. But look, I have really no problems with it. I have no problems with sort of emphasizing first-person perspective more, but I think it's also, it creates new problems.
Yeah, I just think the altered states of consciousness literature is very interesting because it takes you to places where you realize, well, actually you can still have the experience of being a self, or you know, there's still something that it's like to be you and have a narrative.
Absolutely.
But the normal way of experiencing the world disappears and is very fragmented.
Well, I completely agree with this, because I think what this also shows, and if you want, these Botvinnik type experiments of the rubber hand illusion, or now these out-of-body illusions and so on, also seem to suggest that the conscious scene, our representation of self and world, is highly plastic and is continuously following the statistics of the inputs that we are exposed to. It's not really very firmly defined. It's very pragmatically defined by some active system, right? But in some sense, I think what you can try to explain are the processes underlying that, while staying very agnostic about possible contents. Because possible content, certainly if you look at this altered states of consciousness literature, I can believe I'm a poached egg, right? And okay, you've told me this in the past that I look like one, but still I don't think I am one. But anyway, so I think these content issues we should decouple from the process issues. So I'm a bit more focused on process. Yeah. Thanks for that interruption. So now that we have sort of a definition of the conscious scene with its limitations, and we also see that it's different ingredients with respect to the experts that define the current state of the art, I want to point out something confusing based on a very classic experiment by Libet. It's an absolute classic in the literature, in psychology. It has been replicated many times, and it really seems to be extremely confusing in its consequences. So that I think makes it very interesting. So what Libet, he took subjects and he measured what he called the readiness potential. So he had an electrode above the motor cortex, so he could measure when there would be a change in neural activity in this area, which you would think would relate in some way with action, right? Because you control your limbs, your body from this area. But then he asked subjects to watch a clock, so they saw just a clock move, and then they were told, look, whenever you feel like it, I want you to push the button. That was the instruction, okay? But then they were asked to keep track of this clock and to indicate when they've subjectively felt that they made their decision, that they wanted to push the button. This became the whole experiment, and the whole question now became, okay, how well is now this neural response to the movement aligned with this subjective report? And Libet could align it because he has this clock moving, right? So, now what he observed is that when he aligned the subjective reports of I made the decision or I'm going to move with this readiness potential, the changes in brain activity that relate to movement, he saw this big latency difference, right? So what was surprising in this experiment, and it's still a big conundrum in the literature and the different interpretations, and there's still big discussions about it, how come, and it again decouples conscious states from the causes of behavior, that okay, how come my subjective experience is about half a second after the brain already decided to go and do something? And then this has also given rise to a huge literature on the illusion of conscious will. There's a nice book by Wagner on this that summarizes this literature. It's also the title, The Illusion of Conscious Will. And they want to say, look, if all the causes of behavior are occurring underneath this radar, below the radar of consciousness, also in time, then free will doesn't exist. So I think that it's not that binary and so simple, but this experiment gave rise to a huge follow-up set of experiments that are really extremely interesting. So, but for me, the consequence is a different one. And that's this one here. So here we have our unified scene, okay? Whatever it is. We have a unified scene that we know now, at least intuitively, is maintained by the brain in ways we still don't understand, but involving quite some neurons, some hardware, so there's a huge metabolic cost to do this. Now we have here Libet's experiment as well. This scene that you maintain is actually always running almost half a second behind real time. It's out of touch with the real-time control of the world and your body. So this is very surprising, right? Because here I'm rolling down the arrow of time. Okay, I'm acting in the real world. And then here's my conscious scene that sort of follows behind with a huge delay. But my actions have to happen here in real time. I have to do stuff to survive. So as a result, authors like Dan Dennett and others said, well, you know, maybe it's all just an epiphenomenon. Indeed, maybe it cannot cause behavior. Maybe it's just a little extra left over in evolution that we now can enjoy and mess up with ketamine. But in terms of our behavior, our action in the world, it really doesn't matter. And I find that dissatisfactory. So Jerry Edelman, in his theory on consciousness, distinguishes different forms of consciousness, right? So you have a primary consciousness and a secondary consciousness. And basically, and Thomas Metzinger has sort of a comparable interpretation where you would say, well, at the primary level, all we have is convergence of sensors. You could say, look, I could be a worm, and in some sense, to control behavior, action, some of the sensors have to converge to certain points, so I can follow a gradient of some nutrients, or I can avoid an obstacle, and so on. Then at the next level, what you would have at the secondary level is a representation of these sensor states. I have a first level of representation of the self, my body, and the world I'm in. And then at the third level, you start to have a meta-representation of the self, so that the self can become an object that you manipulate in memory. You can reflect on the self. And then Jerry Edelman sees in here a very critical role of language and symbols, if you want, that can boost then these conscious states. So another element now to bring in is that we don't have to think necessarily about consciousness as a very monolithic, structured process, right? We can have also levels of conscious states. All these similar points have also been made by Björn Merker. Björn had a beautiful paper in BBS 2007, I think, where he talks about the conscious states of hydrocephalic children, which have actually very little cortex left and are very strongly dependent on brainstem and midbrain structures. And Björn makes a very important point there, that also at that level we might not see highly advanced forms of consciousness and symbolic reasoning and so on, but they're still conscious states nevertheless. And then at the center of that proposal stands a theme. This is very compatible with how now Giulio Tononi thinks about it, or the global workspace people, that there is some dynamic core in the brain, a dynamic structure, and then it's dynamic because content can change rapidly. And this dynamic core is then sort of taking in information from the world and from the self to define these conscious states. But the question remains, so what's also important here, this is an important distinction with the proposals made by Francis Crick and Christoph Koch, which I think is an important methodological point, right? Because Christoph Koch and Francis Crick we're always introduce this notion of the neural correlate of consciousness. Okay, and so they would say, look, we don't need to have a predictive or explanatory theory of consciousness to investigate it. What we can do is we can have humans, we change their experience in some way. We can do, let's say, repeat limits experiment, we can flash visual stimuli at them, and we can then just measure from them. We can measure using fMRI, or we can go use other technologies, and then just hunt the correlations between conscious states. And then out of those correlations, hopefully some theory will emerge at some point. Okay? So this is one direction, that you just focus very strongly on just collecting all these correlations that will exist in the world. Jerry Edelman's proposal is more theory-driven, where he says, no, I have a theory, and from this theory I'm going to make specific predictions I'm going to test. Okay? So these are two different schools of thought of how consciousness should be pursued. And nowadays, the neural correlate approach is definitely dominating the field, also because it's easier. I mean, to hunt correlations is a lot easier than to make specific predictions that you test. Anyway, so then as an expression of this notion of integration in the dynamic core that Jerry Edelman proposed, Giulio Tononi came up with the notion of phi. Phi, there's a book called Phi, this is the symbol of Phi, and it is very much dominating the current theories in the field, or the current thinking in the field. But I think maybe in the last conference of the Association for the Scientific Study of Consciousness in San Diego, in June, if I'm correct, we might have reached a point that it lost its appeal for many of the people pursuing it. So this is Giulio Tononi. The key thing is to say, look, I can have a quantitative measure to assess this level of integration, right? I can look at the brain. Here we have Christoph Koch in the New York Times. He says, look, this is the most promising fundamental theory of consciousness we have today. So Christoph is cheerleading this, and Christoph is not someone who's unimportant, right? He is the scientific director of the Allen Institute, huge amounts of money to map the brain. Also a strong background, working of course also with Christoph Koch, with Francis Crick on consciousness. So there's a lot of attention for the integration information theory, and the basic idea is, look, I want to have a measure, right? Remember, the conscious state for integration information theory is an informational structure that's coherent, right? My conscious scene is integrated, it's whole, it's unitary. I cannot split it up any further. But then it's also highly differentiated. So that basically means in the total information space of the brain, right, I can differentiate these subsets. And at some point I cannot differentiate any further. This is the minimal partition I can make in all possible states of the brain, and that's my conscious scene. If you want, quantitatively, it is a variation on an entropy measure, because essentially you're saying, look, what's the variability in this system? And in some sense, intuition of these measures that they also have applied on different types of patients and so on is, okay, the higher this complexity of the brain, the higher the conscious state. Okay, this is roughly the intuition behind this measure. But now, what I did, this was something, a little exercise I did for a session in this, the last conference of the Consciousness Society. This is the work that Carney has been doing with our collaborators in Rome, and especially Stefano Farina and Gustavo Deco here in Barcelona. We have just found out something really interesting, which we'll summarize very shortly. So, now hold this in your working memory that we're actually dealing with consciousness, because I've explained something else, and it will be very quick. In decision making, the standard interpretation are what's called bounded diffusion models. So you can think about, look, I can go left or I can right. Left and right each will have certain cues in the world that provide evidence for this decision. So I sample the world, I accumulate evidence, and whichever of these two horses, you could say, whichever of these two options reaches a threshold first, that's what I will do. Right? So I'm an integrator. I integrate evidence, and it's also very compatible with so-called Bayesian models of decision making. And then, so there's a lot of literature behind this that shows that monkeys, when you give them certain decision-making tasks, would appear to follow these kinds of regularities, and also for humans. So now we can take a look at, okay, is this really the way in which the brain now encodes relevant information? And this is relevant directly for our discussion on consciousness, because you would assume that also in decision making there is a conscious representation of a task. I am consciously experiencing what I'm making decisions about. So now we predicted that, well, we get later to this later. We wanted to understand what the role was of memory in decision making, and for that we went to a countermanding task. We looked at the responses in the dorsal premotor area in a task where the monkey. Oh, maybe I'm running out of power. So the monkey basically had to was trained to respond to a cue, to move its hand left or right, but then on top of the, so it would get a fruit reward when it would succeed. But then if it at unpredictable moments for the monkey, it would also get a signal that told it to stop moving. Okay. So that's what's called countermanding, right? So you initiate the movement, but then while doing so, the monkey gets told, like, no, interrupt. Okay. And then Carney has analyzed this in great detail if you want to know more about it. So basically what Carney showed, which was extremely interesting, is that if we look at the firing rate in this premotor cortex, and we split it out for a trial where you have a go signal. So basically, okay, the monkey can go, it will not get an interrupt. But the preceding trial, either was also a go or there was a stop. Okay, so this is not the only distinction. Then you see that the firing rate in this dorsal premotor area is actually identical. Right? So the firing rate cannot predict what the monkey will do. While if you take another measure, if you look at the variability of the neural response, the intertrial variability, so you look at one trial, you say, okay, what's the variability here? You compare it to another trial. So you have a measure now of the intertrial variability. That intertrial variability, so here in blue it's go-go and in red it's stop-go, is actually strongly different. And it turns out that this variability rate is not predictive for performance of the monkey, and the variability is. So here we have the reaction time of the monkey for the different trials. Here you see how this intertrial variability scales with the different task conditions, and from that Carney was able to very accurately predict performance. So variability seems to be highly important in encoding decision-making variables. But in the meantime, you could say, well, decision-making, this intertrial variability, should also be reflected in the conscious scene. So as a little exercise, I calculated this phi measure of Giulio Tononi over the same neural data that we had from Carney. So why is this an interesting exercise? Well, Giulio is saying phi is a specific measure for conscious states. Okay, so this would mean that, so let me go here. We now know that, okay, the cue comes on which I have to make a decision, right? Then at some point, okay, the neurons are performing their operations. At some point, I execute my action. Here we have this intertrial variability, okay? We know that intertrial variability is highly an accurate predictor of performance. But the conscious awareness of the task, we know also from the Libet experiment, would follow with some delay. You're not conscious of the whole period immediately. This will take some time. So this would suggest if this phi measure of consciousness is specific to conscious states, I should only have a value, a reading, a significant reading, when we can assume conscious states occur. But we see actually that this phi measure, another measure of complexity, is actually inversely related to this intertrial variability measure. This is actually of a really great consequence, right? Because see, Christoph Koch is, for instance, saying, and so does Giulio, this is the most important theoretical breakthrough in consciousness, right? But we see it's actually just yet another measure of complexity of brain states. So if we now plot phi versus intertrial variability, you can also see that they're actually strongly related measures. But we're not saying intertrial variability is a measure or a theory of consciousness. So, so we see that even though integration information theory is considered the main theory, it's actually a method, it's not a theory, it's a way to quantify states of the brain. And as such, it has no theoretical consequences how we think about consciousness. They're ontologically neutral. Yeah? So you might remember that Fourier, with his Fourier transform, was the first researcher who sort of disconnected physical states from the world with how we describe and analyze them. He said, look, you can just create a representation of your signal in a frequency space, but it has nothing to do anymore with intrinsic properties of how that signal is expressed in the real world. It's a description of, it's not identical. Right? So the same holds for this integration information theory measure. It's not specific to conscious states, but at best a necessary condition, as I showed you with this comparison of intertrial variability. And it also assumes that integration of information literally takes place. So phi is not really helping us very much about consciousness, so the question is what's next, right? And I spent some time explaining this to you because in the field it has made quite an impact, okay? Okay, this is a little...
But Paul, I mean, you haven't presented any positive evidence. Presumably people have shown correlations for other tasks, have they?
Well, what they basically show is, for instance, if you compare a sleeping human with a human who's awake, then their phi value is somewhat higher, okay, when you're awake versus asleep, okay? But what I'm claiming, what I try to show you with the analysis, an ad hoc analysis we did now on dorsal premotor neurons, I can make a similar statement using the quantification we use of intertrial variability. Or I could take any other entropy measure and make a similar statement, right?
I could defend the theory of IIT by saying, well, of course we wouldn't expect to find it premotor, you know, so, I mean, I don't know if they'd make that move, but...
Now, if you make that move still, then you're still in trouble because it does relate to this notion of some sort of a global workspace that any part of cortex can feed in to that conscious workspace, right? It's not regionalized. That's why the workspace is an important aspect in that debate. Okay?
Well, have you measured your brain state after ketamine with this method?
No, I still have to do that. Yeah, this was something I'd inserted because Christoph Koch had a long debate with the panel about IIT, and Christoph was getting a lot of criticism, and it was getting more and more difficult. And then he said, well, any good theory is counterintuitive, and I can't imagine an alternative. So that was, I thought, not a very convincing argument. But this is all anecdotal. So can we still say something sense about consciousness? What I did, I just decomposed the state of the art. In my view, that I feel that with integration information theory, it might have given rise to interesting experiments somewhat, but it's not really a theory. We still haven't explained consciousness, certainly not as a function, and that's what I would like to do. How are we doing time-wise, Giovanni?
You still have some minutes.
All right, so then now I will explain to you how many?
4.
4?
4 minutes.
Now come on.
Don't you think
But you can stretch it until 1:30 if you want.
All right, good.
People don't escape you.
Good. I'll explain to you now what consciousness is all about. And what I will emphasize here is this part in evolution, which is also called the Cambrian explosion, where, if you want, suddenly all body plans that we know, about 30 body plans that underlie all animals we know today, they all, if you want, appeared in this period of evolution about 500 million years ago, apparently still shifting further back in time. But you see this incredible jump in the variability of animals and life forms on this planet. And I think this is very informative about consciousness, and I want to explain to you why I believe that. So the first thing is, so Dobzhansky wrote a really nice essay in '73. It was the usual debate against the creationists. And he said, look, nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. I think also in the consciousness debate, this is really important, an important consideration, that consciousness has been selected for in some way. It has to give organisms, as an assumption we could say, a fitness advantage. Right? It must support survival. Otherwise, it might still be an epiphenomenon, but you would be hard-pressed to explain why biological systems would dedicate so much resource to an epiphenomenon. Okay? So I think it's a more reasonable starting point. So we cannot be too categorical, but say, well, look, let's just make this assumption that there is a biological function for something like consciousness.
Paul, but I mean, I don't think you can make that step. I mean,
I'm allowed to make the assumption.
no, Stephen Jay Gould destroyed that argument really with his paper about spandrels in cathedrals and how these sometimes things are just inevitable as a consequence of other things being functional. You get things which are inevitable.
Oh wait, sure, Tony. But the point is,
So
I am.
it could be non-functional,
Yeah.
but yet inevitable when you have a complex system that you have something like functional.
That's all fine, but also Stephen Jay Gould gives you a counterfactual, and I'm not saying it must be like this. I'm saying it is reasonable as a starting point to just assume that there is a functional role, and thus my question becomes, what could that functional role be? Let's try this first. And then I can say, well, that's the spandrel as well.
Well, don't you think that animals without consciousness should be extinct?
No, I will explain why.
Okay.
But humans without consciousness are extinct. As the documentary Zombie War showed us. Yeah? Or World War Z, right? Or World War Z. Huh? Okay, so this illustrates the point I just made. I want to just speculate about what the possible organizing principle and function could be of something you could call consciousness. Why would consciousness actually arise? And what could its role be in adaptive behavior? Yeah, this is Tony when he was younger, and as a defender of evolution. Okay, so this is just to illustrate the notion of design principles of brains, and as far as I'm concerned, consciousness is not a unique human feature. You will find it throughout mammalian brains, and I would claim also bees. You might find echoes of it in bee brains. Okay? Yes, please.
Do we know which life form is the simplest or earliest to have like a conscious experience?
No.
Any theories or assumptions?
Well, I have a theory, which is, and I would draw the line roughly at bees, and I will explain later. Later will become apparent why that is. Okay? And this is Tony in nature. So this is just to emphasize that brains evolved, brains share design principles, and as I also told you last Monday, we should also think about this tight coupling of environment, body, and brain. These are not necessarily clearly distinct aspects. So, what's the function of the brain? It's an architectural question. This is one of the first sketches of brain architecture from Romanes, 19th century. So he tries to show what are the common features between these different animals, from amoebas to humans. So you see, amoebas don't have much reason, humans do, and amoebas have lots of reflexes, and humans have very little reflexes, and so on. But it's an architectural interpretation of our brain. And the function of the brain, which is extremely interesting, if you go to a Society of Neuroscience meeting, as Aldo and many others have done, and you ask these neuroscientists, like, hey, what do you think is the function of the brain? The majority will giggle because they feel like, well, but I'm just looking at this GABA receptor, and it's not my business to speculate about the function of the brain. All right? But I do believe it is useful to have a hypothesis about functions of brain, and as far as I'm concerned, following Pavlov, it is very much to maintain an equilibrium between an organism and its environment. Right? So it's a mediator. And this equilibrium is achieved through action. So here we have an animal model that describes everything your life is about. So basically I'm saying, with respect to the interactions with the physical world, this video illustrates everything that is of relevance. So that means here we have a rat. It's shuttling up and down between a home base and a food source. It's eating the pellets in the corner, some it will take home, but it understands this environment, in terms of it expresses some understanding of the environment by its effective interaction with it. And you can describe that in what I call the H4W problem, which I will define. So H stands for the act, to know how to deal with the world. And this is predicated on answering 4 questions. Okay? And this is why, so what are the motivations of my behavior? Why do I act? What are the objects in the world that pertain to my wishes and goals? Where are these objects located? Where am I located in the world? What's the spatial layout of my environment? And when? How do I time my actions so I have an effective interaction with this world? And I'm saying the brain of an organism that only deals with the physical world has to solve these 4 problems, and only these 4 problems. Okay, so brains have evolved to solve, with respect to the physical world, to solve these 4 problems in different ways. So to act means solving the H4W problem, and then for that I built a theory of the brain, how this is done. And essentially what I'm proposing is the brain is a layered architecture where we go from the body to, let's say, a reactive level of control, innate reflexes, an adaptive layer, which if you want allows you to learn a state space and to have immediate acquired reactions and actions upon the world, followed by a contextual layer, an example of which would be these frontal areas, as Aldo spoke about, where you exploit different mechanisms of memory to put states together so you can form policies and plans for action. Okay, this if you want to implement it, this is the manual. And this is what these robots could do. For instance, here we have a robot controlled by this model. So it sees a cue, then it uses a model of spatial cognition, only using its own sensor cue, so not using GPS or markers in the floor and so on. It has learned place preferences, so it goes to locations in space that it has associated with that cue. It got a reward there, and then it goes back. So what you see, this robot has a motivation to act, to find these rewards in the environment. It has an idea of objects in the world. It can, for instance, read these cues as objects. It has notions of location. It knows something about their spatial relations, and it can time its action so it can end up in these places in an adaptive fashion. So now I will jump ahead a little bit because I thought I would be much slower than I was. Let me see. Because I was going to make a whole plug of how this explains the brain, and it's all fantastic, but I can do that some other time. If you're interested, you can just ask me. So let's just, what I discovered is that, remember, we looked at consciousness, we looked at the standard views on consciousness going from self to global workspace. What I saw is that if I look at this distributed adaptive control architecture and theory that we have developed, that it seems to match, at least at the level of hypothesis, it seems to match rather well on this distinction that we can make in the literature on the different ingredients of consciousness and different stages of consciousness, right? So if we look at levels of consciousness, you see that this sort of zero order consciousness that Thomas Metzinger talks about, or Jerry Edelman, convergence of sensors, we find at our reactive level, somatic reactive level. Secondary consciousness, the representation of these states, now I have a representation of a body, of a chair, and so on, are realized in this theory at the level of adaptive control, while the contextual layer allows me to acquire higher level representations of these states. So on the one hand, the theory in a sort of an initial form is not finished in any way, but it has an encouraging match to this notion of the levels of consciousness that people converge on. On the other hand, we can go to this notion of the embodiment and self, which was the first axiom of the 4-5 stage model of consciousness as the state of the art defines it, to the immediate sensory motor coupling with the world at a reactive and adaptive level, as Kevin O'Regan would see it, to levels of prediction, as for instance Gary Haslow would have it, which is built on this immediate interaction stage, and then levels of differentiation and integration. So again, at this at level of intuitive descriptions, it seems that the theory that we have developed, following this H4W problem, is capturing these core ingredients of how we look at consciousness, which is encouraging. It doesn't explain everything, it's encouraging, let's say, but it also shows the point I made earlier responding to Tony, that these different stages of consciousness appearing in the literature are at best necessary conditions, because indeed I would not claim that these models applied to robots are conscious. Christoph Koch and Giulio Tononi do, right? They take a robot model, the robots do something trivial, they calculate how many bits of information these robots have and say, oh, this is the amount of consciousness of this robot model. I can do exactly the same thing, but I think it's incorrect, it's wrong. So what's missing? So it's this jump here, because I believe in the Cambrian something very fundamental happened. And the fundamental thing that happened that I think called for functions like consciousness, which I will explain to you, is that who emerged. H4W was not relevant anymore, because now I was in a world with other agents. And these agents could be prey, they could be predator, they could be conspecifics. Now why is this such an important change? Why is it such a qualitative change so that we have to speak of H5W? Well, this is the problem. If this is me, I'm embedded in a world with agents, and every agent has its own H4W to satisfy, right? I want coffee. Okay, but the point is, it's not visible at the outside. I cannot see this. I cannot directly perceive these states. These are hidden states. Okay? So the point is that those hidden states I have to infer. I have to make inferences about Tim's internal states. And in some sense it might be better not to even try to do that. Right? So the point is, these social agents that suddenly emerged in the Cambrian created a whole new problem. Right? A stone communicates its features, it doesn't communicate, but it displays its features as a stone with a very high probability just by observing its surface properties. Social agents don't have this. On top of that, they might even cheat on you and pretend they're going to do one thing and do the other. Right? So suddenly this creates a whole new problem that we have to solve in order to survive. And so here we see an agent, a social agent, engaging with a complex world. And the point is that as a result, the world suddenly becomes filled with intentional states. So Dan Dennett has called this the intentional stance, and he looked at it more from a pragmatic perspective. But so the point is that suddenly I could not treat the world anymore as only having physical objects, but no, now I had objects that had wishes and goals that I had to infer. Yes, please, Richard.
Well, I agree with the intentional stance hypothesis.
Thank you.
The problem is that how do you explain then the dissociation of the emergence of other agents, which was 500 million years ago during the Cambrian revolution and the evolution of consciousness, which was, well, extremely distant in time. It wasn't.
How do you know
otherwise,
that?
you have to say that evolution
How
of
do you know that?
consciousness evolved 500 million years ago.
You seem to know things I don't know, young man.
Well, just you said in your presentation just now that the Cambrian evolution created a new problem to
Yes.
solve, and that this would be the basis for this.
No, but Richard, maybe
consciousness.
what I wasn't clear about. I'm saying that consciousness also emerged then.
Yes, exactly. You are actually saying that consciousness evolved 500 million years
Yeah,
ago.
exactly right. So then things are
I find it
all.
surprising. I don't know. Maybe that's
Including,
Oh.
including
Oh, it might be surprising, but this is my speculation that I try to make plausible. Yeah.
we include like the sense of ego in that at the same time.
No.
You're
No.
talking about who, right?
I'm explaining what I have in mind, and this also will explain why I believe bees, for instance, are conscious. But bees don't have psychoanalysts, at least we have not found them yet. The waggle dance is too restricted to tell them about your mother, right? So, my speculation is, I'm going to fill that in a little bit, and it matches also my earlier claims, is that if I'm exposed to this world filled with vicious agents that are all trying to eat you, how do I defend myself against this? These agents don't show me what they're up to. So that means effectively I have to run internal simulations, right? So this is also axiom 3 of the integrated model. I have to run simulations of these agents to start to make predictions and inferences about their states with respect to my own goals, okay? So, but now to do that, I must parallelize computation because I don't know which of you is the mad suicide bomber, right? So I have to run simulations in parallel on all agents in my environment. So this is of course quite a computational demand. I have to, as a result, parallelize my operations. And I have to virtualize the world because I have to believe, right, that Tim here is very supportive of my theory. But I can be completely wrong because he doesn't give a damn. Right? But so that means I'm virtualizing what's out there. I have to virtualize because I don't have sufficient information. All right? So that means I have to virtualize the world, I have to run internal models of my world, and that demands a computational resource which is parallel. So now here we have the cerebellum, my cerebellar chip, and the cerebellum in humans has 15 million parallel loops. So it's really an implementation of a parallel computer, and each of these loops is prediction based, is making predictions about the events in the world, and it gives you event triggers. So we built many models of the cerebellum. They give you event triggers about when it thinks stuff should happen or will happen. Okay? So the cerebellum is a very good example of such a parallel virtualizer, if you want, with 15 million loops. But now, if I would use this chip system we have built in the version that I showed you here, and I would build this human cerebellum, this human simulation system, I would have a stack of 150 kilometers of chips. Okay? So it gives you a feeling of the scale of the computations I'm performing in spatial terms, what your cerebellum is doing. And the consequence of this is that I have a new credit assignment problem. That means if I now perform correctly or incorrectly, if I fail or succeed, how do I figure out which of all these parallel simulation loops actually help me to achieve my goal? Right? So I have a new credit assignment problem because all these systems, certainly the cerebellum, all these loops are independent, all work independently. They don't give a damn what the neighbors are doing. They generate their triggers. Okay? They are really conditioned on a very specific event. But my behavior is the result of all of them working together. Right? So I have to unify this output. I have to unify my description of what I do to say, this was right and that was wrong. Okay?
But this is precisely the same argument that Tonini uses for IIT. The fact that all these things have to be kind of connected somehow, right?
That's right. No, I'm not debating with the idea of a unified scene or an integrated scene. I have no problems with that. The concept of integration goes back to William James, right? So indeed, and so Tim already got it, so he's very supportive of my theory, is that consciousness, the conscious scene, is an answer to this credit assignment problem, right? So that basically means I'm acting in the world in real time. This is a parallel and unconscious process, so I have real-time performance. I can deal with the world with very short latencies. But now I serialize everything, I serialize my performance, I say, no, this is my task, this is me in the world, this is really what I'm doing, okay? And this now allows me to define values, to say, I should not burp in public. People look very strange when I do that, all right? Even though in parallel I was doing many other things as well, like breathing and moving my feet and whatever, okay? So you are forced to compress all these states into one, to collapse everything that is possible into one that you believe is actual, so that you can say, and this is what I did, and this is why I did it, and this is wrong, and this is right, this is how I can optimize my parallel processing. And that's exactly why this makes sense of this limit result, because this is why the serial conscious state runs behind real time with a delay. It has to integrate this information to say, okay, and this is it, this is what I'm really doing. Richard, you're just waving at me, or you have a question?
Last question.
Okay, no, it's no problem.
Okay, let's assume that this happened, that consciousness started evolving 500 million years ago in order to accurately predict and observe the intentional stances of other agents and their internal lives.
Yeah.
Wouldn't we be much better at doing that right now, if that happened?
What would be much better? The world.
Wouldn't we be much better at deciphering the intentional stances and internal lives of other agents?
Why would you believe that?
Because there was 500 years to evolve.
Million.
Yeah.
500 million years to
Mhm.
evolve this system.
No, but look.
So why is it so bad right now that we cannot even tell what other people are thinking?
Right, exactly. So, well, but the point is, of course, I mean, you can one, there's the complexity of cognition and behavior to start with, the variability, and also, of course, you have many methods to also fake information and try to mislead others and so on.
So
right?
there's like a counterpart to this evolutionary adjustment that works to hide your own.
Of course, absolutely, you hide even more. This is a typical evolutionary arms race. So actually, you're trying to fool me with your question.
That would be the answer.
Exactly.
So your point is you need this sort of offline processing to sort of calculate all possible quantum effects?
Quantum effects?
Well, this sort of parallel world of possible intentionalities.
No, look, I mean, so here I am, I give this talk. Yeah? Let's say it's not clear whether it's going to be successful or not, right? But still, at a moment-to-moment basis, I must assess what I do to adjust. I cannot really know what all of you think, even though you're all convinced by what I say. So I better assume you're all convinced by what I say. So now I have one unitary interpretation. I can adjust my behavior. I can say, oh, I don't have to explain some basic stuff anymore. I know where I'm going. That's the intuition.
So you're building some kind of model of that, right?
That's right, but they exist on submodels that exist in this parallel system as well. But yes, the conscious scene is, if you want, based on it's not necessarily a model because it is unitary and it's in some way deterministic. This is it, right? This is the interpretation. This is your existence. And now, given that decision, you can adjust and fine tune. So this is basically the idea. Okay, so this is summarized here, right? So I act, I interpret, I optimize my parallel processing so I can act in the future. And this also means that this whole idea of not instantaneously operational in the limit experiment is a feature, not a bug. That means this is not an epiphenomenon because it's delayed, but it by necessity has to be delayed to come to a unitary description. Right? So, okay, this is another way too. So then, the hard problem. So this is all speculation, right? There's no data. but there's some sort of circumstantial evidence based on this modeling work. You say, well, this might be a reasonable way to think about it. So of course now it's all about turning this into an experimental agenda. So how are we going to do that? Well, this goes back to an early challenge by Tony, who is clearly not supportive enough, so I have to work on that, about subjectivity, right? About, well, isn't it all about this first-person perspective and about experience? Isn't consciousness really about the heart problem? Because I gave you a rather operational, functional story. And so, well, this is how we can think about it. Okay? Now, Nagel and Chalmers and these other philosophers put their finger, in some sense, of course, on limitations of science. Because we have agreed that empirical science progresses through observation, right? We have hypotheses, we make predictions, we observe to test these predictions, and now we have some sort of mismatch, and we go into our next cycle. It's also called an empirical cycle that we're in. The philosophers who read their books on philosophy of science said, aha, this is called objective because it's third person. I can build a science of Tim Pierce because I can observe what Tim does, updating his Facebook page when I give a talk, right? So, yeah, don't think I didn't see that. So no, but the point here is, since I'm not Tim, I can make a theory about him because I can observe. I'm independent, supposedly. But the subjective state, I don't have the third person view. It's all first person. Then the philosopher would say, like, aha, you see, that's first person. That's not science. It has to be third person from the outside. So how do we solve that problem really? So how do we get to a third person view? Well, that's where the robots come in. This is why I believe that a theory, to test my theory of consciousness, I must build a conscious robot. Because I can have a third person view on those internal states that might be the subjective states of this machine. Right? So methodologically, this is what I have to do. So here we have model number 1, which learns to play a strange version of table tennis, and then induces...
Cricket.
Huh?
Cricket.
Cricket, yes, a cricket robot. Oh, Tony, you must like that. And then it induces highly emotional states in the students, as you will see shortly. Oh, I cut it out. That's too bad. Actually, the shoulder got dislocated. The students all panic, you know. It was a project here at BCBT. So basically, I will not go into the details of this, but we have already now built a model of attention, top-down, bottom-up attention that we see as a starting point in this modeling exercise. And essentially, what this model says is, look, we live in a world of predictions. We'll go back to predicting the world. And I basically put around stuff in the world blobs of reliability. So every one of you has a blob around you about your position. I said, look, as long as people stay within that position space, I'm not going to pay attention because the world is predictable. That's what we call this work with Zen and Matthews.
But then David Chalmers would say you just created a zombie that tricked you and you didn't generate any true qualia.
Sure, you can say that, yes.
That's what he would say, right?
But then you have to define. But then you have to define what's a true qualia, right? Because if you phrase it like this, you are saying, okay, you are creating some form of qualia, but they're not the right ones.
Tony's point about first person, right? These qualia, where did they come from?
Okay, look, I will explain this to you. Anyway, so also we have been doing some fMRI on this, which I will not explain. We see some changes in more frontal areas, and the bottom line of this is what we're modeling now. I see consciousness as a transient memory system that maintains a conscious scene. It's the interpretation of what is now, your belief about the world, and that resides in the dynamic loops of the brain, in particular the thalamocortical system. Okay, this is what we're after. This is the idea, like a transient memory system that sort of resides in the thalamocortical system. But this isn't how we're going to build this robot. Here we have the connectome of a sentient robot. So this is where we're going to go with this. Alberto always looks like that. So here we have a connectome of the human brain. You might have seen that in the XAM. And now what we're going to do is, so Alberto is the brain master here, so he's interacting with this connectome. So that means we're going to build biologically constrained models at a scale that are comparable to the human brain, but that are interfaced to humanoid robots. Okay, so that means the sensor states of the robot are fed back into this connectome constrained model of the brain, while also the actions, that in this case are induced by Alberto, will be executed by the robot.
Is it a neural network or something?
Well, this is a representation of the human connectome that we have interfaced to a neural simulator called IQR. You might have heard about IQR. So now we can actually simulate a connectome, look at dynamical features. That then also in this way we can interface to robots, right? So
the idea being trying to work along these ideas of a dynamic core in some sense.
That's exactly right? Because now, for instance, this idea of the dynamic core in the thalamocortical system, I can now directly test out here, bringing in the constraints from the neuroscience of the human brain, right? So we are not stuck necessarily just with our MATLAB approximations. We can now directly map it and exploit the available data on the anatomy and the physiology of the human brain. I thought we had sound with this, but all the sound is turned off for some reason. Here you see, this is what's inspiring Alberto to control this brain. Okay, that's it. Unconscious robot. All right, so...
Sorry?
Yes, please.
I didn't quite understand it. Was the robot controlled by IQR or was the sensory input just fed into a network?
Well, look, in this case, in this video, we try to sketch the system we're constructing for this, okay? So we're not worried, we were not too worried about how the information was really matched. It's just to show this is the kind of system we're now building. Because remember, I'm saying, okay, I gave you a theoretical construct. I could, look, this is my story about consciousness, and I can give it some plausibility. Then I told you, to really test this, I have to build a conscious robot, because this is how I get around the hard problem, even though there are caveats, like Tim points out, and you're right, okay? We can get back to that. So now I have to build my conscious robot, and what I showed you is how we're going to do that in terms of its infrastructure. Right?
It's more planned than the actual implementation at this point.
Well, no, the key ingredients are there, but for instance, the whole mapping of the sensor states to this connectome has not done in a very clean way. This is all, if you want, fake, yes. But so the links and the loops are there. But for instance, if you have a connectome, which is a highly abstract description for human brain, and here I have a camera on a robot that has an image. Where do I really inject that, and how do I transform? I mean, these things are not solved.
The question was just the motor output was not controlled by this connectome, but by like some kind of...
Oh, no, the motor output can control this robot, because that's an arbitrary mapping that you can define arbitrary mappings. That's easy, right?
Is this like a liquid state machine or something?
No.
I mean, you've got
No.
these dynamics and you're doing a readout to control.
No, because this is the connectome describes, if you want, is based more on fMRI whole brain view, where you say, look, I have n nodes, which might be 600 nodes. I know what their activity is, their average activity as measured with fMRI at a certain time scale. So it's a very rough approximation, right? So you're
actually replaying fMRI data.
You can do that if you want, but here in this example, which is just a demonstration video, Alberto is injecting energy into this system with his gestures, and in that way he can control what this robot does.
But kind of sounds a bit like a liquid state machine. No? You've got a big network, you provide some complex stimulus in some way, it produces some complex...
In the literature,
dynamics.
people would not compare the connectome with the liquid state machine. They would say more, well, inside the nodes of the connectome you might find liquid state machine-like dynamics. It's not comparable. The density of connectivity is not comparable.
Sure. Sure, you're right. The key difference is that there's a clear structure to the networks here, whereas in a liquid state machine, you say really the opposite. Yeah. But the idea kind of, okay, yeah.
In the connectomics, which has its own problems, okay? I'm not saying that's the holy grail now. Connectomics, the whole issue there is what are the core wiring templates about at the core, at a rather macroscopic level of brain organization. What are the key hubs in the system, and what are more the slaves, if you want, in that whole structure? These are the kinds of questions you deal with there. Yeah? So my story is that consciousness has evolved to solve a very specific problem that emerged about 500 million years ago. And that's of social interaction, dealing with other agents. And that's why I believe, and as a signature, you need brains that have highly parallel structures because they have to simulate options. And there was a really nice paper earlier this year by Nick Strausfeld where they look at, for instance, the similarities between invertebrate brains and vertebrate brains, emphasizing actually this as one of the features where you can find similarities between Drosophila, bees, and vertebrates. So a brain signature of this is parallel structures, and that's why for me bees are satisfying these constraints. Bees have strongly parallel organized brains, for instance, in their mushroom bodies and the protocerebrum. You have a lot of parallel loops running through there. Comparable, not identical, but comparable to the kinds of parallel loops you might see in the human cerebellum, but also the whole brain is a very loopy structure in our case. So you can find many examples of this. So for me, consciousness was a response to an evolutionary pressure to deal with social interaction. So you will find it in social animals, including bees and other kinds of insects. So it is throughout these different phyla, you will find it.
Sorry, I have a very small question. So, as I understand correctly, you were saying that in the cerebellum, the human brain is using this structure to understand what happens, mainly, no? And then this is an unconscious process, then it precipitates in the conscience somewhere.
Well, this is the problem you have to solve now. Like for instance, the cerebellum, you have lots of highly specialized single loops that are waiting for their triggering event to happen. They're completely specialized. If this happens, then after 200 milliseconds, I send a trigger. That's what these guys do. There's very, very confined predictions on events. Okay.
So my question is just when a person is alien in the cerebellum, does he experience that he cannot understand other people, or just a motor problem, and how this could affect your
big discussion actually. The traditional interpretation, which goes back to the 19th century, is like, oh, these are only motor problems. But there's an emerging literature that people point to deficits also in cognitive processing with its different ramifications. I'm not aware of any literature really on specific deficits of social interaction. That I cannot tell you. Tony.
So I think, have you finished, or is there more?
No, this is my concluding. I can tell you more if you want.
No, I think it's enough, and we can have a good discussion here about brains, and brains clearly solve the H5W problem. I don't see what using the word consciousness really adds to that statement, because as you've shown really nicely, you can build robots that have all these lower layers of consciousness, and if they run around and people say they're conscious, we would be inclined to just laugh at them. And you've said, well, okay, add theory of mind on top of that, and suddenly we've got consciousness. It just looks like another red herring that's what's missing from the robot. Once we have that missing ingredient, suddenly we'll have consciousness. But what that shows quite beautifully is that you don't need to have a box which gives you consciousness. You don't even really need a box which is a unified scene. You have lots of different representations. The robot's experience of the world, if it's working properly, is such that it seems to have a unified scene. Kavanaugh-Reagan shows that we really don't have a rich unified scene in our heads, that full of gaps. Change blindness shows that. And this shows that you can operate really effectively without building all these complex these central representations that we imagine we have.
Right.
So I like this work, and I think it's a great theory for people like Chalmers. It shows that we can explain everything that we want to explain about human thought and behavior without using the term consciousness, which I think is now redundant. It's an old-fashioned scientific idea.
Look, the point is, I don't, so many words that you uttered, I can agree with, even in the order in which you expressed them, but not all. So basically what I'm saying is there's something missing in this structure, in this theory, as we have explored it. Okay, there's something missing that we haven't done yet, that I think we have to do. So far, we always looked at this system as dealing with fairly restricted physical environments where every event, every episode is, okay, it can be complex, you might have some ambiguities, but it doesn't have the dynamics of social interaction, right? So the complexity of tasks we've explored is not that high yet. And what I'm predicting is that I have to add, if you want, a loop in this system, an interaction between components that adds a new kind of transient memory system that gives the model, the robot, a unitary description of what it's doing, so that it can afford to maintain more ambiguous and plural representations in other systems. For instance, look at all those prefrontal cortex where you see that you can maintain multiple goals simultaneously, right? But in the end, you can only perform, you are in one task. There must be a system that says, and this is it. This is what you are doing. This is what your life is about. This is it. And I'm saying that's missing here. This is too parallel. And that loop that's missing, that gives you this transient memory with a unitary description of your task, on that loop I put this label consciousness because I think it makes sense. I think it helps. I think it gives me leverage because it has this notion of virtualization. But yes, you might be completely right.
Isn't that just another homunculus?
No. But to answer Tony, if we find a better label, I'm fairly agnostic about that.
Well, I prefer the term integration for what you're talking about here.
No, because integration, your superior colliculus is integrating as well, right?
Your flatworm integrates, and so.
I find it not specific enough.
So yeah, then you add your who problem onto that, and I think you get a richer levels of representation.
It's interesting. I mean, you could also imagine that you just talk about integration at different orders of integration, and you could say, well, at some order could be comparable to what other people call secondary consciousness, something like this. Yes, I have no problem with that, but I do believe. We should not shy away from this idea of virtualization, a unitary scene, and also subjectivity and self, and what that really then means in the regulation of adaptive behavior.
I suppose if you put this into ICOM and without cheating at all, if ICOM could spontaneously generate first-person perspective, then that might be a demonstration of sorts.
How would you know that? I mean,
well, this is an issue.
Mm-hmm. Well, this was my methodological answer to the hard problem, right? I'm saying yes, and it's why is it accessible? I can explain that, Tim. The point is, subjective states are not accessible to us because I cannot control time and space. You are evolving in time as I am. So now you say something like this is all nonsense, whatever. So I can say, oh, well, this is probably because 5 years ago, I didn't give Tim a beer when he wanted one, something like this, right? But now that interpretation of your subjective state, I cannot verify in any way. However, if you would be a robot in this experiment, I can have a record of all your input and output states that ever occurred. So at least I theoretically have a possibility to reconstruct every subjective state that system has. And that might make it accessible. That's the point, right? The robot allows me to, if you want, control time, in theory. And that's how I can, I think, make progress on the hard problem.
I think the qualia, I think Kevin O'Regan has got a solution to that problem, which is better than most that I've heard. And then the first person perspective, he would argue, and I think along with Metziger, and I think I would agree with them, that it's a construct, that it's a useful construct that helps us, for instance, solve your theory of mind problem.
Mm-hmm.
If I construct an idea of myself as an actor,
Sure.
then
It's like other like self. Absolutely.
yeah, and so so you can see first-person perspective arising through pressures because you're having to socialize.
Mm-hmm.
And,
Yes.
and I think that's a pretty complete explanation of all the phenomena that we want to explain, including qualia, and consciousness is gone out the window.
Well, look, what you're sidestepping here is this issue of plurality, inference, ambiguity, and so on, right? Because even though I interpret you as me, you are not me, which is too bad for you. But, right? So I can never be sure. So I still have this issue of ambiguity, internal simulation, and then you have plural view. You have potential, right? Possible states of Tony. But in the end, I have to make it one and act upon that one.
But then if you're a split personality,
Me.
no, well, maybe, but but somebody who has a split personality, that shows that it can fragment. You can operate as one person, the next day as another person.
That's a very interesting example, yeah. But that would not necessarily. So the point is, I don't see why would you like to reduce away a notion of consciousness and not reduce away a notion of attention, for instance? What's the hang up with consciousness here? What's the problem with just trying to deal with this issue of a unified scene, for instance, that really can help you to structure adaptive behavior and solve this credit assignment problem?
Well, I mean, if you want to call consciousness having a unified scene, that's okay. It's just in a label.
Mm-hmm.
But you're in the same position then as Tononi, who says that consciousness is IIT.
Well, there's some difference here, right? This is also more implementational. This is more at the Jerry Edelman part of the story where you say, and this is a theory that I can build. It's not a measure. It's not a correlate, right? That's an important distinction here.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to understand why it is we experience a unified scene when we experience that.
Yeah.
And to that extent, I'm completely with the program.
Mm-hmm.
But my interpretation of the outcome of the program will be that we'll have replaced theories of consciousness with something much more specific
Mm-hmm.
and much more scientific and much more explanatory.
Look, of course I would be happy with that, right?
Yeah.
It's not about that word. Like Jesus must be reborn. Armin.
So would the theory actually predict something about human consciousness? So what would the theory predict as an experiment that we could do on humans to actually measure if some of this is reasonable?
Well, so one prediction that came out of the work by Zenon was this idea that if you can split an attentional system around one maintaining this conscious scene and the other one just performing a task. So in that case, it would be something like, well, if I'm not overloading my resources, I can unify the representation of my task with actually monitoring that task. But if I'm now under a situation of cognitive load, I have to make compromises. Now I have to choose what I'm going to do. Am I still going to monitor and run this task, or am I going to maintain my conscious scene to understand what the hell I'm doing? And so we did some experiments on this where we looked at different attentional tasks under cognitive load, combined this with fMRI, to see some sort of dissociation in the brain in these high and low cognitive load conditions, where you see that the more automatic task that initially was maintained by her frontal areas, under cognitive load was sort of offloaded to more temporal areas. So that means cognitive load is induced by telling a subject, okay, now you should recite the alphabet backwards, skipping every second letter, something like this, right? So this is now their conscious task that they're engaging in, and then you see an offloading of this initial task to other areas, which seem to suggest a bit, it feeds a bit in this whole idea of maintaining a transient memory system. Really tells you this is your task, and you're compromising the content of that dependent on demands. This is one, around this we can make different predictions. The other one I think is we can do work with neglect patients, which I would find extremely interesting, where you would expect discrepancies between the conscious scenes they maintain and the information they have access to, right? So in our case, the visual world maps roughly on our subjective experience of the visual world. Well, if you have neglect, as for instance a stroke patient, parts of this virtual world for subjective experience disappear. So I think there we have another kind of paradigm where we can test this idea of how a conscious scene is maintained, what information feeds into it. So these are the kinds of experiments I was thinking about we can try on humans. If you have a better idea, I happily listen to it.
Was there anything in the cerebellum while having a cognitive load? Would you see any offloading down to cerebellum in this experiment?
I don't think so. And if so, it was minimal. We have this was looked into.
Why do you focus on the cerebellum? Because most people are thinking about thalamocortical.
Oh wait, I just used the cerebellum if you want to illustrate an issue. It was just to trigger your interest to say, isn't it amazing that the majority of your neural hardware is committed to tasks that are not necessarily feeding into consciousness?
Then you were relating it to large numbers
Parallel.
of cerebellum chips.
Parallel processing.
What else?
That was parallel processing to give you a feeling for the scale of that problem. Like you have 15 million parallel loops doing their own stuff. How do you credit assignment in that system?
And it comes back to the original question that you posed, which is very interesting, right? How does the cerebellum actually play a role in all of this, right?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah.
Which is not clear.
Absolutely, it isn't. No.
It doesn't explain. It doesn't really help to explain what the cerebellum is doing in all of this.
Wait. I know what the cerebellum is doing, but it's not a story. Okay? So I just started with the cerebellum to trigger your interest by saying the majority of neural hardware is operating underneath the radar of consciousness. Isn't that amazing?
It should be doing something like computing all of these possible...
And that's what I'm saying. This is what it is doing. It sits there under the radar running all these completely incoherent and probably contradictory simulations. And that's why it cannot give you high levels of integration. Okay?
Sorry, can I suggest that we continue over lunch because it's very late, or is that okay? So let's thank the speaker. And of course, next year we will attend your next lecture, which is what it's like to be an ICAP.
Yes, exactly. Or what it is like to be wrong. But I'm never wrong, so that talk will never happen.
But it will be an ICAP.